Hi, this is Kathy with City Farmhouse Studio. And one of the first things whenever I started crocheting that I had questions on and didn't quite understand was what a gauge swatch was and what the purpose of it is. The main thing is you spend all this time making a garment or an item. You want to make sure that when you're done, it is the size you want it to be. You don't want any surprises. You don't want to make a sweater to fit you and it doesn't even fit a child, or you don't want to spend all the time to make it and two of you can fit into it as well. So a gauge swatch makes sure that the stitch that you make with the yarn that you're using makes the stitches fit the same dimensions to fill out so many stitches and so many rows per inch. So for a gauge swatch, you need to chain so many numbers of stitches and then work the desired number of stitches and rows of that. To determine how wide you need to make it, a good kind of starting point is taking the gauge that's in the pattern. So where it says 4 inches by 4 inches equals so many stitches by rows, take that stitch number and multiply it by 1.5, and that will get you a good starting point so that you can measure 4 inches and not have to worry about the edge stitches. Once you have your swatch created and you want to make it kind of a square so that whenever you measure your rows, you still won't be measuring the end portions as well. And what you'll need to do is take a ruler, and some people even have a fancy ruler with a 4 inches cut out so you can really see where you're measuring from 4 inches. And you're going to want to line it up from one stitch. So I'm lining it from here. And then I'm going to count from where the 4 inches ends. I'm going to count how many stitches lie between that dimension. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. So I have 20 stitches for this gauge, for this size of hook with this fabric. And then you're going to do the same thing with rows. And with this single crochet, these little lines help me count. The nubs are one, and then this indent is another row. So again, I'm going to line it up for 4 inches. And from nub to nub, that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22, 24. So my gauge for this stitch, this single crochet stitch with this hook and this yarn, is 20 stitches by 24. Now, whenever I went up a hook size, the same number of stitches, same number of rows, this is the swatch on the bottom that I made. And you can see it's just slightly more open. It does have a little bit softer feel. It's not as stiff and hard. So depending on what garment you're making or what project, if you're making a basket or a bag, you might want something a little firmer. But if you're wanting something to wear, something a little bit softer. But you can see my gauge is going to change because that same number of stitches, same number of rows, it's a little bit wider and a little bit taller. With this dimension, I have 19 stitches by 23 rows to get my gauge. So even though it's the same number of stitches, less stitches and less rows are taking up an inch square. I even went up one more size, and this is a really nice softer fabric. It's still fairly dense, and again you can see same number of stitches, same rows. Again, it's going to have even less. So I had 18 by 22, 19 by 23, and 20 by 24. So one stitch, one row difference going up in a hook size. Now, what if I had just a different yarn? It's categorized the same as the yarn. It's the same material. What happens? Again, everything on the label looked the same, but whenever I worked it up, I'm getting a much tighter gauge. And this one is much closer to that smaller hook size, it is 20 stitches by 25 rows. So you may be thinking that all of these are fairly close. One stitch off, one row off, it wouldn't make that much of a difference. So let's take an example. Let's say your gauge for the pattern is being called for this. And you're wanting to make a 42-inch bust sweater, and it is 23 inches long. If your gauge of the material that you make is that one size up, where instead of 20 to 24 stitches for a gauge, you're getting 19 by 23. They're fairly close on the swatch, not much difference. But that 42-inch bust to 23-inch length becomes a 44.25-inch bust and a 24-inch length. And that's just being off by one stitch in one row. So that 42-inch bust is about where a size large would be. If you're making a size for anything over that, you're going to even have a larger difference of your stitches in rows because you have more width of your fabric to add up those differences in sizes. Another thing you're going to want to do is take note of your measurements between your unblocked swatch, write it down, make sure you have it marked, and then go ahead and block it, wash it, dry it, lay it out flat, however you're going to treat the finished item, and take another measurement. Lining these two up, same stitch, same everything. My length grew just a little bit over the edge, and that's just by this little swatch. So if I'm making a larger pattern, very long, that may impact. But different stitches, different materials, everything blocks completely different. So you're going to want to see what your finished item is going to look like as well. But you need to know what your working gauge is as well, so that as you're working your project, you can keep referring back to that finished item. I had this happen to me. I was making a sweater and I pulled off the sleeve and it looked very, very short. And I'm looking at it and it's like, well, I know whenever it blocks it, I have this number, but I don't know my gauge swatch for the sleeve unblocked. And I had to block it to see, and it didn't work. So you're going to have your unblocked measurement so you can compare that to what your in-progress work is to make sure your gauge isn't changing as you go along. Because there are several things that do change gauge, and some of it can just be as you're working on a garment or a project, you're more relaxed, you're more stressed, can affect how tightly you're holding the yarn, pulling it through. Watching a tenseful movie, watching a comedy, all of that takes into consideration on how you're treating your yarn and really pulling it tight or just more of a relaxed fit. It really changes how, even with the same hook, you can get a different gauge. As we talked before, the different yarn or just a different yarn gauge or even just yarn material can get you a different gauge as you're working through a pattern. Of course, being different stitches, a single crochet to a double crochet, the double crochets you're going to cover more width as you go up. So you won't have as many rows in your gauge swatch if that pattern includes double crochets or treble crochets or even shells, fans, ripples. All of those will really change your gauge. Besides using different hooks, not just different sizes, but the materials will have a different impact. The different brands have different sizes of heads on the hooks, but also the material, how that fiber will run across the aluminum, the plastic, whether it's solid or even translucent. Bamboo really changes depending on whether it's like a true boo type yarn, that bamboo yarn, or is it wool, cotton, really a lot of different drags. I've also noticed whenever hooks have a handle, I tend to not be as tight with them. I'm more relaxed. So that can impact your gauge as well. Another option that you could do is add a few more rows or take some rows out, especially on a sweater underneath to shorten or lengthen the body. You can also add rows at the sleeve cuff or up at the shoulder to make your sleeve a little bit longer. Take them out to make things shorter. But whenever you get shaping, like underneath the arm or around a neckline, when you start taking out rows or even stitches to make things narrower, you're going to affect everything overall. So just make sure everything balances out. Another thing you can do is completely change the math for what the pattern has called and create the pattern into the math of your gauge. That does take a lot of work, and it's a whole nother video besides this, but it is an option. I do know some people that for a sweater, they'll make the width, how many stitches, meet the one size that their gauge fits, and then follow along a different size, whether their gauge makes things smaller or larger than what the pattern gauge calls for. But again, whenever you get into shaping, how many rows to stitches, things increase and decrease. It could get a little bit tricky. So I hope with all this information you now know a little bit more about gauge swatches and why they are so important. If anything, just taking that little bit of extra time to create a little swatch will save you a whole lot of headache in the long run, so that you know all the time you put into whatever you're making, it is going to come out exactly how you want it to. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss out on any other tutorials from City Farmhouse Studio. Bye.